Imagine a city of 500,000 people with no people in it. Apartment towers climbing 30 stories into the sky, their windows reflecting nothing but each other. Six-lane boulevards stretching to the horizon without a single car. Fountains designed to enchant crowds that will never gather. Shopping malls where the only footsteps echo from security guards making their rounds through corridors that were supposed to hum with commerce. This isn't a scene from a post-apocalyptic film. It's Ordos Kangbashi, a district in Inner Mongolia built to house nearly 1 million residents, where at its emptiest fewer than 30,000 people actually lived. And it's just one of dozens of ghost cities scattered across China, representing one of the most extraordinary economic phenomena of our time. These cities aren't accidents. They're not the remnants of some catastrophe or the forgotten dreams of bankrupt developers. They are the deliberate product of economic policy, the physical manifestation of theories about growth and development pushed to scales never before attempted in human history. To understand why a government would pour billions of dollars into constructing cities that nobody asked for and nobody lives in requires us to journey through the evolution of economic thought, the psychology of political systems, and the mechanics of what happens when state power meets misaligned incentives at unprecedented magnitude. The spectacle of China's ghost cities first captured global attention in the early 2010s, when photographers and journalists began documenting these surreal landscapes. Tianduching, a replica of Paris complete with its own 100-meter-tall Eiffel Tower, stands in Zhejiang province with broad Haussmann-style boulevards designed for strolling crowds that rarely materialize. Xiong'an New District near Kunming in Yunnan province was planned as a university town, an administrative center, its modernist architecture and orderly grid serving a fraction of its intended population for years after construction. Thames Town outside Shanghai recreates an English market town with cobblestone streets, Tudor-style buildings, and red telephone boxes, functioning more as an occasional wedding photography backdrop than as the vibrant community its planners envisioned. The scale defies easy comprehension. Estimates suggest that China has built enough empty housing to accommodate 65 million people or more, entire cities' worth of apartments sitting dark at night, their kitchens never used, their bedrooms never slept in. In some developments, owners have purchased units purely as investment vehicles, never intending to occupy them, treating concrete and steel as a store of value rather than a shelter. The buildings themselves are often finished to varying degrees, some complete with landscaping and amenities, others mere shells with unfinished interiors, their elevators disabled to save electricity, their lobbies gathering dust. The psychological effect of these spaces is profound. Humans evolved in environments dense with other humans. Our brains finely tuned to detect faces in crowds, to read social cues, to navigate the complex web of community. Environments built for human habitation that lack humans trigger a deep cognitive dissonance, an uncanny valley effect normally associated with near-human robots or computer-generated faces. These cities feel wrong at an instinctive level. They possess all the visual markers of civilization: traffic lights dutifully changing colors, street lamps illuminating empty sidewalks at dusk, public art installations standing in plazas where no public gathers. Yet they lack the essential ingredient that makes a city: people going about the business of living. This absence has made ghost cities objects of fascination, particularly for Western observers. Photographers document them with the aesthetic sensibility usually reserved for ruins, finding beauty in the contrast between human ambition and human absence. Some of this fascination is straightforward curiosity about an alternative economic system producing results so alien to market-driven development. Some of it carries an edge of triumphalism, a sense that these empty towers validate the superiority of capitalist systems where demand precedes supply. But beneath both responses lies a more universal anxiety about what these cities represent. The question of whether our systems of organizing economic life are fundamentally rational or whether they're subject to runaway processes that produce colossal waste regardless of the ideological framework guiding them. But these aren't failures of planning or accidents of development. They're the intended consequence of a deliberate economic philosophy, one that would have seemed utopian to a British economist writing nearly a century ago during the depths of the Great Depression. John Maynard Keynes published his general theory of employment, interest, and money in 1936, in the midst of the worst economic collapse the industrialized world had ever experienced. For years, unemployment in major economies had exceeded 20%. Factories sat idle. Skilled workers queued at soup kitchens. The dominant economic wisdom of the time held that markets would naturally self-correct, that if only wages fell far enough and prices dropped sufficiently, supply and demand would find their equilibrium and prosperity would return. But years into the Depression, this promised correction had not materialized. People were starving not because society couldn't produce enough food, but because the machinery of the economy had seized up. Keynes identified what he called the paradox of thrift. In a downturn, rational individuals try to save more and spend less, protecting themselves against an uncertain future. But when everyone simultaneously reduces spending, one person's spending being another person's income, the result is a downward spiral. Businesses see falling demand and lay off workers. Those workers reduce their spending further. More businesses fail. The very rationality of individual behavior produces collective catastrophe. Classical economics assumed this couldn't persist because prices and wages would fall until equilibrium returned. Keynes argued that in a complex modern economy with sticky wages, debt contracts, and psychological expectations, this process could trap an economy in a stable equilibrium of mass unemployment. His solution was radical for its time. Government must become the spender of last resort. When private actors are hoarding cash and refusing to invest or consume, the state must step in and spend on their behalf, even if it means running deficits, even if it means borrowing. The mechanism was the multiplier effect. Every dollar the government spent would flow through the economy multiple times. A government worker paid to build a road spends her wages at local shops. Those shopkeepers order more inventory from suppliers. Those suppliers hire more workers, and each transaction generates tax revenue that partially offsets the original spending. $1 of government spending might generate $1.50 or more in total economic activity. This wasn't meant as a theory of permanent government expansion. Keynes envisioned countercyclical policy. Spend during recessions to maintain demand, but save during booms to pay down debt and prevent overheating. The goal was to smooth out the destructive boom-bust cycles that had plagued capitalism since the Industrial Revolution to achieve something approaching full employment and stable growth. It was an attempt to save capitalism from its own excesses, to demonstrate that market economies could be managed without abandoning markets themselves. The political appeal was immediate. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal in the United States, though predating Keynes's formal theory, embodied similar logic. The Hoover Dam, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the countless roads and bridges and public buildings constructed by government programs. These weren't just relief for the unemployed, they were attempts to restart a stalled economic engine through direct government action. The visible, tangible nature of infrastructure spending made it particularly attractive. A politician could attend a ribbon-cutting ceremony, point to a new hospital or highway, and claim credit for action in the face of crisis. It beat the alternative of telling voters that the economy would eventually sort itself out if they could just be patient a little longer. After World War II, Keynesian economics became the dominant framework in Western democracies. The post-war boom seemed to validate its core insights. Governments maintained high employment through active fiscal policy. The welfare state expanded. The devastating cycles of the pre-war era seemed consigned to history. But by the 1970s, cracks appeared. Stagflation, the combination of high inflation and high unemployment, wasn't supposed to be possible in the Keynesian framework. Monetarists led by Milton Friedman argued that Keynes had been wrong about the long-run Phillips curve trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Public choice theorists pointed out that politicians face incentives to spend during both recessions and booms, that the ratchet effect makes it easy to expand government but nearly impossible to shrink it. Loss aversion, the psychological tendency to feel the pain of losses more acutely than the pleasure of equivalent gains, meant that cutting programs generated fierce opposition while expanding them faced less resistance. By the time China began its economic reform era in the late 1970s, Keynesian economics had been significantly qualified and challenged in the West, but its core insights about the power of government spending to stimulate demand remained part of the policy toolkit. China would take these insights and push them to extremes that would have astonished Keynes himself. The Chinese Communist Party maintained a commitment to Marxist-Leninist ideology even as it embraced market reforms under Deng Xiaoping. This created an unusual hybrid. Private enterprise was permitted, encouraged even, but always within a framework of ultimate state control. The commanding heights of the economy remained in state hands. Banks, major industrial concerns, energy and telecommunications, all operated under varying degrees of state ownership and direction. This created the possibility of economic coordination at scales impossible in market economies where thousands of independent actors make decentralized decisions based on price signals. The system that emerged had a particular feature that would prove crucial to understanding ghost cities. Local Communist Party officials were evaluated and promoted primarily based on measurable economic metrics, above all GDP growth. This wasn't an accident. The central government faced a fundamental challenge. How do you govern a country of over 1 billion people spanning a territory as large as the United States? How do you ensure that local officials in far-flung provinces actually implement central directives? The answer was to create a promotion tournament. Local party secretaries compete against each other for advancement to higher positions. Those who deliver rapid economic growth in their jurisdictions move up. Those who don't. This system powerfully aligns incentives. An ambitious local official in a third-tier city knows exactly what the scorecard measures: GDP growth. And the fastest way to generate GDP growth is construction. Building creates immediate economic activity. It employs armies of migrant workers. It consumes steel, cement, glass, and 1,000 other materials. Every ton of concrete poured adds to that quarter's GDP figures. By contrast, improving education or healthcare generates benefits that show up years later, long after the official has moved to a different position. The incentive structure explicitly rewards short-term, visible activity over long-term, diffuse improvements in quality of life. Understanding the theory is essential, but it doesn't explain why China took this particular path, building cities for ghosts rather than roads, bridges, or schools. To understand that, we need to examine the mechanics of China's political economy and the incentive structures that drive local officials to pour concrete. The cadre evaluation system created what some scholars call a promotion tournament among local officials. Imagine you're a Communist Party secretary in a provincial capital. You're in your late 40s, ambitious, educated, and you've risen through the ranks by demonstrating competence and loyalty. You know that to advance to a position at the national level, you need to distinguish yourself from your peers running other cities and provinces. The central government has made clear that economic performance is the primary criterion for evaluation. But economic performance is measured mainly through GDP growth rates. This creates a peculiar set of incentives. GDP measures economic activity, but it makes no distinction between productive and unproductive activity. If you pay workers to dig holes and other workers to fill them in, GDP rises. If you build an apartment building that nobody will ever live in, GDP rises. If you construct a shopping mall that will never house a single shop, GDP rises. The metric captures motion but not direction, activity but not utility. Psychologically, this taps into deep currents of status competition and career anxiety. Party officials are not so different from ambitious professionals anywhere. They want advancement, recognition, the satisfaction of rising through a competitive hierarchy. They're embedded in a system where their peers are also striving for limited positions at higher levels. The fear of being left behind, of seeing a rival promoted while you stagnate, creates intense pressure to do whatever the evaluation system rewards. And the evaluation system rewards measurable, attributable economic activity. This isn't unique to China. Soviet factory managers famously met production quotas by producing goods that nobody wanted, that often couldn't even be used. If the quota specified tons of nails, factories would produce enormous, unusable nails to meet the weight target efficiently. If the quota specified numbers of nails, they'd produce tiny pins. The problem of measuring performance in ways that align individual incentives with collective welfare is one that every large organization faces. But in China's case, the scale and resources available amplified the consequences to extraordinary levels. The financial machinery that enables this construction requires understanding China's peculiar fiscal arrangement. Starting in the 1990s, Tax reforms centralized revenue collection while leaving expenditure responsibilities at the local level. Local governments were stripped of most taxation powers, but remained responsible for providing services and infrastructure in their jurisdictions. This created an obvious problem. How do local governments fund development if they can't tax? The answer was land. Local governments retained ownership of urban land. They could convert agricultural land to urban use and sell long-term lease rights to developers. This land finance system became the primary funding mechanism for local development. A local government would designate an area for development, compensate farmers for their land at relatively low rates, invest in basic infrastructure to make the land attractive, then auction off lease rights to real estate developers. The proceeds from these land sales would fund further infrastructure, government operations, and more development. But this created its own dynamic. The value of land depends on the infrastructure around it and expectations of future development. If a local government builds roads, sewage systems, and public amenities in an area, nearby land becomes more valuable. This creates a feedback loop. Use land sale proceeds to build infrastructure. Use the increased land values to justify higher prices for the next parcel of land. Use those proceeds to build more infrastructure. As long as land values keep rising, the system is self-sustaining and generates enormous revenues. The financial engineering became increasingly sophisticated. Local governments couldn't legally borrow directly, so they created local government financing vehicles, shadow banking entities that exist in a gray area between public and private. These LGFVs would borrow from state-owned banks using future land sales as implicit collateral. The borrowed money would fund infrastructure that would theoretically increase land values, enabling more borrowing. The banks were willing to lend because they understood that these entities had government backing. If an LGFV couldn't repay, the local government would find a way. And if the local government couldn't, the central government ultimately stood behind the system. This is moral hazard on a municipal scale, the too big to fail doctrine applied to cities. For 2 decades, from the mid-1990s through the early 2010s, this system worked spectacularly well. It funded genuine development. Hundreds of millions of people moved from rural poverty to urban middle-class living standards. Infrastructure that had been generations behind the developed world caught up, and in some areas surpassed it. High-speed rail networks, modern airports, subway systems in dozens of cities. This was real development addressing real needs. The problem was that the incentive structure didn't include a natural stopping point. It rewarded construction regardless of whether anyone needed what was being built. The construction and industrial complex that grew to service this demand developed its own momentum. China's steel industry expanded to produce more steel in a single year than the United States produced in an entire decade. Cement production reached levels where China was using more cement in 3 years than the United States used in the entire 20th century. These industries employed millions of workers. Entire supply chains from iron ore mines in Australia to glass factories in Guangdong depended on continued construction. This created a classic sunk cost fallacy at the national level. Having built this enormous industrial capacity, political pressure mounted to keep it running. Shutting down steel mills means unemployed workers. Unemployed workers means social instability. Social instability threatens the party's legitimacy. So even when domestic demand for new buildings weakened, even when cities already had more apartments than they could fill, the pressure to keep building remained. The construction sector wasn't just building cities anymore. It was employing a substantial fraction of the workforce, consuming a significant fraction of industrial output, and generating a large share of economic growth. Stopping meant recession. Japan's experience after its bubble economy burst in the early 1990s offered a cautionary parallel. Japanese construction companies, politically powerful and facing declining private demand, successfully lobbied for massive public works spending. The result was bridges connecting lightly populated islands to the mainland, highways through depopulated mountain regions, elaborate coastal concrete works protecting beaches few people visited. These bridges to nowhere became symbols of wasteful stimulus spending. But China's version operated at a scale that made Japan's experience look modest. Where Japan built unnecessary bridges, China built unnecessary cities. The principal agent problem illuminates the core dysfunction. Those making the decisions about what to build are local officials seeking promotion. Those bearing the consequences are taxpayers, bank depositors, and future generations who will inherit the debt. The decision-makers capture the benefits, career advancement, the prestige of overseeing dramatic development, while the costs are dispersed and delayed. Each individual actor behaves rationally within the system's incentive structure, but the collective outcome is profoundly irrational. Cities built for populations that don't exist, funded by debt that may never be repaid. Western democracies theoretically limit such runaway processes through several mechanisms. Electoral accountability means voters can punish politicians who waste resources on white elephants. Independent media can investigate and expose boondoggles. Bankruptcy procedures allow failed projects to be unwound without bringing down entire financial systems. These mechanisms are imperfect. Western democracies have certainly built their share of unused infrastructure, but they provide friction that slows the process. China's system, centralized in its broad directives but fragmented in its execution, powerful in its capacity to mobilize resources but weak in its feedback mechanisms, allowed the ghost city phenomenon to reach unprecedented scale. The machine is powerful and self-sustaining, but it's not inevitable or permanent. Economic gravity eventually asserts itself. The question isn't whether the ghost cities represent a problem. It's whether China can manage the consequences of its own success at stimulus on steroids. The financial reckoning began to crystallize in the early 2020s, though warning signs had been visible for years. Local government debt, much of it held in off-balance sheet vehicles and therefore difficult to quantify precisely, was estimated to range somewhere between $7 and $13 trillion, depending on what you counted and how. To put that in perspective, it exceeded the GDP of every country except the United States and China itself. Much of this debt was effectively backed by land whose value depended on continued development and rising prices. If land values stopped rising, if they fell, the collateral backing the entire system would erode. The property sector, which had grown to represent roughly a quarter of China's economic activity when you included construction, materials, and related services, began showing serious stress. Evergrande, once China's largest property developer with projects in hundreds of cities, defaulted on its obligations in 2021. The company had borrowed aggressively, selling apartments before they were built and using the proceeds to fund new projects, a Ponzi-like structure that worked brilliantly in a rising market but collapsed when growth slowed. Evergrande alone had more than $300 billion in liabilities. Its failure wasn't an isolated incident, but rather the most visible symptom of a sector-wide problem. The banking system's health became a central concern. State-owned banks had lent trillions to property developers and local government financing vehicles, loans that looked secure when backed by appreciating real estate, but looked increasingly questionable as prices stagnated or fell. The official non-performing loan figures were suspiciously low, suggesting that banks were extending and pretending, rolling over bad loans rather than recognizing losses. This works as a temporary measure but stores up larger problems for the future. Deflationary pressures emerged as oversupply met weakening demand. Property prices in some cities began falling. For a development model predicated on ever-rising land values, deflation is poison. It turns the feedback loop into a vicious cycle. Falling prices mean lower land sale revenues. Lower revenues mean local governments can't service debts or fund new infrastructure. Less infrastructure spending means lower land values. Each step reinforces the decline. Historical parallels offered both lessons and warnings. Japan's experience after its bubble burst in 1990 showed that a country could avoid catastrophic collapse but pay the price in decades of stagnation. Japanese authorities chose to support banks and avoid mass bankruptcies, but the result was a long, grinding deleveraging process. Zombie companies kept alive by cheap credit that should have been allowed to fail, and growth rates that rarely exceeded 2% for a generation. But Japan was a rich country when its bubble burst, with per capita incomes near the world's highest. China's bubble is occurring at a much earlier stage of development, with per capita GDP still a fraction of advanced economies. The American savings and loan crisis of the late 1980s offered a different lesson. Hundreds of financial institutions failed. The cleanup cost taxpayers hundreds of billions of dollars. But the decisive action, shutting down insolvent institutions and forcing recognition of losses, allowed the system to reset relatively quickly. The question for China was whether its political system could tolerate such decisive action with the mass bankruptcies and unemployment that would entail, or whether it would choose the Japanese path of slow-motion adjustment. Some economists invoked the Triffin dilemma, originally formulated about international reserve currencies, but applicable here in modified form. China couldn't stimulate forever without eventually triggering a debt or currency crisis. But stopping stimulus risked triggering the very recession the stimulus was designed to prevent. There was no path that avoided pain, only choices about what kind of pain and when. The social costs extended beyond the purely financial. Every yuan spent building empty apartments was a yuan not spent on education, healthcare, or pension systems that desperately needed strengthening. China's demographic profile was shifting rapidly. The one-child policy had created a society that would age faster than any in history. The ratio of working-age adults to retirees was set to deteriorate dramatically over coming decades. An aging society needs social services, medical care, and retirement security. The resources poured into ghost cities represented a massive opportunity cost, a choice to prioritize measurable GDP growth over less visible but more important social infrastructure. Regional inequality worsened in perverse ways. Ghost cities concentrated in interior provinces trying to attract development, while coastal cities facing genuine housing demand saw prices rise to unaffordable levels. Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen experienced property bubbles where ordinary workers couldn't afford to buy homes in the cities where they worked, while Ordos and Xiong'an stood half-empty. The mismatch between where people wanted to live and where construction occurred revealed the fundamental problem with top-down allocation divorced from market signals. For China's middle class, property had become the primary store of wealth in the absence of well-developed financial markets and capital controls that limited overseas investment. Family savings were locked in real estate, whose value increasingly seemed questionable. The psychological impact of watching property values stagnate or decline after decades of steady increases affected consumer confidence and spending. The generational wealth transfer from parents to children that had been assumed to flow through property inheritance looked less certain. Broke local governments began cutting services. Teachers and civil servants in some jurisdictions went months without full pay. Infrastructure maintenance was deferred. The migrants who had built the ghost cities often couldn't afford to live in them. A construction worker who spent years pouring concrete for apartment towers in Ordos returned to his rural village because he couldn't afford an apartment in the city he helped build. The irony was bitter. Cities designed to house populations stood empty while the people who built them remained inadequately housed. The philosophical question lurking beneath the balance sheets was fundamental. What is development for? Is GDP growth an end in itself, or a means to human flourishing? The economist Amartya Sen argued for judging development by the expansion of human capabilities, the real freedoms people have to live lives they have reason to value. By that measure, empty cities represent a profound failure. They expanded measured economic activity while contributing little to human capabilities and potentially constraining them through the debt burden and opportunity costs they created. Environmental costs added another dimension to the ledger. Cement production is carbon-intensive, accounting for roughly 8% of global carbon dioxide emissions. China's construction boom contributed significantly to its position as the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. In an era of mounting climate crisis, the resources consumed building cities nobody lives in represent not just economic waste, but environmental tragedy. Sand for concrete, water for cement production in arid regions, the energy required to produce and transport materials, all extracted and expended to create structures of limited utility. The central government under Xi Jinping began attempting to change course in the mid-2010s. The rhetoric shifted from emphasizing growth quantity to growth quality. The Common Prosperity campaign aimed to reorient the economy away from property speculation toward manufacturing, innovation, and more equitable distribution of gains. The Three Red Lines policy implemented in 2020 imposed debt limits on property developers, an attempt to deflate the bubble in controlled fashion. But these policies faced the fundamental challenge that any successful deflation of the bubble would trigger exactly the financial stress and unemployment they hoped to avoid. Evergrande's subsequent collapse illustrated the dilemma. You can't have a controlled deflation of a bubble. Once confidence breaks, events take on their own momentum. The balancing act required maintaining enough economic activity to prevent mass unemployment while weaning the economy off its addiction to property-driven growth. This meant tolerating slower growth rates, something that conflicted with long-standing political imperatives and social expectations. Decades of rapid growth had created an assumption that 7, 8, or 10% annual growth was normal. Adjusting expectations downward proved psychologically and politically difficult. The ghost cities force us to confront fundamental questions about how economies should be organized, who decides what gets built, and whether there are limits to the power of state-directed investment. The answers matter far beyond China's borders. The Keynesian paradox emerges clearly in the ghost cities. Keynes was both vindicated and refuted. His core insight that government spending can maintain economic activity and employment in the face of private sector retrenchment proved correct. China successfully avoided the mass unemployment that classical economics would have predicted. But the waste revealed by empty cities demonstrates the limits of stimulus divorced from market signals. Keynes assumed that government spending would address genuine unmet needs. The ghost cities show what happens when the incentive is simply to spend, regardless of whether what you're building serves any human purpose. Friedrich Hayek's knowledge problem, articulated in his challenge to central planning, finds tragic validation. Hayek argued that the dispersed knowledge of millions of individuals making decentralized decisions based on local information could never be replicated by central planners, no matter how intelligent or well-intentioned. Prices in a market economy aggregate this dispersed information, signaling what people actually want and value. China's ghost cities represent the knowledge problem made concrete. Central directives and local officials' incentives produced construction on a grand scale, but without the information that market prices provide about what people actually demand, the result was magnificent waste. Yet Western market economies have their own failures. The 2008 financial crisis demonstrated that markets can produce catastrophic misallocation through bubbles, herd behavior, and misaligned incentives in financial systems. The question isn't whether markets or states are better in some abstract sense, but how to design institutions that harness both market information and state capacity while limiting the pathologies of each. Democratic accountability provides friction that authoritarian systems lack. Politicians who oversee massive wasteful projects can be voted out. Opposition parties can highlight boondoggles during campaigns. Independent media can investigate and expose waste. These mechanisms don't prevent all wasteful spending. Every democracy has its white elephants, but they create counterpressures that limit excesses. China's system, lacking these feedback mechanisms, allowed the ghost city phenomenon to metastasize before the central government moved to rein it in. Yet democracies face their own challenges with infrastructure investment. Electoral cycles create incentives for short-term thinking. Politicians want ribbon-cutting ceremonies during their terms, not projects that will benefit constituents a decade hence. Special interests can block needed infrastructure through litigation and lobbying. Environmental reviews and public consultations can delay or kill projects that would genuinely benefit communities. China built high-speed rail connecting major cities in the time it took California to fail to complete even one line. The efficiency of authoritarian systems in implementing large projects is real. The challenge is ensuring that efficiency serves genuine human needs rather than bureaucratic incentives. The ghost cities phenomenon has global resonance. China's Belt and Road Initiative, the massive infrastructure program spanning dozens of countries, raised questions about whether China was exporting its model. Ports in Sri Lanka and Pakistan that couldn't service their debt to Chinese lenders, railways in East Africa operating far below capacity, infrastructure projects that seemed designed more to employ Chinese construction companies and consume Chinese materials than to meet genuine local needs, all echoed the ghost city dynamic. Build first, worry about demand later. The geopolitical implications of debt-trap diplomacy aside, the economic pattern was familiar. Western countries debating infrastructure investment face questions about scale, scope, and oversight informed by China's experience. How much should governments spend? On what? Who decides? What accountability mechanisms ensure resources go to projects that serve public needs rather than political or bureaucratic interests? The ghost cities don't provide simple answers, but they illuminate the stakes of getting these questions wrong. For developing countries, the build it and they will come model of development carries an allure. Creating world-class infrastructure seems like a shortcut to prosperity. But China's ghost cities demonstrate the danger. Infrastructure is valuable when it serves existing or plausibly near-term demand. It becomes a liability when it's built speculatively in hopes of conjuring demand that may never materialize. The fundamental development challenge remains expanding human capabilities and productivity, not constructing impressive but underutilized structures. Climate considerations add urgency to these questions. The planet cannot afford construction-led growth at Chinese scale replicated globally. The carbon emissions, resource depletion, and environmental damage would be catastrophic. Yet hundreds of millions of people still lack adequate housing and infrastructure. How to provide for genuine human needs without repeating China's wasteful excesses represents one of the central challenges of sustainable development. Some economists and activists promote degrowth, questioning whether perpetual GDP expansion should remain the organizing principle of economic policy. The ghost cities inadvertently strengthen this argument. They reveal how the pursuit of growth as measured by GDP can produce waste when divorced from genuine improvements in human welfare. Perhaps what's needed isn't faster growth, but better growth, development oriented toward human and ecological flourishing rather than maximizing a flawed metric. The psychology of sunk costs helps explain why changing course proves so difficult. Having invested trillions in property and construction, Chinese authorities face enormous pressure to justify those investments by completing projects, maintaining asset values, and avoiding recognition of losses. This applies at every level. The central government that oversaw the system's creation, the local officials who implemented it, the banks that financed it, the families whose savings are locked in property, all have incentives to believe that values will recover, that the investments will eventually pay off, that the ghost cities will fill with residents. Admitting that vast resources were wasted is psychologically painful for individuals and politically dangerous for governments. Cognitive biases compound the problem. The availability heuristic makes visible buildings seem like success even when they serve no function. A local official can point to dramatic skylines and claim credit for transformation even if the buildings are empty. Confirmation bias leads supporters of the model to see evidence that validates their approach and dismiss contrary evidence. Data showing increasing GDP from construction confirms the policy's success. Empty apartments are temporary, explicable, someone else's problem. The tension between individual and systemic rationality runs through the entire story. Each actor in the system behaved logically given their incentives. Local officials built to get promoted. Banks lent because they had implicit government guarantees. Families bought property because it had always appreciated and alternatives were limited. Construction companies built because they were paid to build. Materials suppliers supplied materials because there was demand. Each decision was individually rational. Yet the collective outcome was systemically irrational. Enormous resources deployed to create assets of limited utility, funded by debts of questionable sustainability. Cultural factors shape how different societies navigate these dilemmas. Confucian traditions emphasizing long-term planning, collective goals, and deference to expert authority arguably enabled both China's remarkable development success and its ghost city excesses. The same cultural attributes that allowed coherent long-term infrastructure planning also limited the questioning of authority that might have applied brakes earlier. Whether this represents genuinely different time preferences or rationalization of elite preferences is debatable, but culture clearly shapes economic outcomes in ways that simple universal models miss. This raises the eternal question about institutional design. Can we create systems that align individual incentives with collective welfare? Is it possible to harness human motivations towards socially beneficial ends? Or is the mismatch between individual rationality and collective irrationality an inevitable feature of human organization? Markets channel self-interest toward productive ends when property rights are clear and competition is vigorous, but produce bubbles, exploitation, and instability when those conditions don't hold. States can coordinate action and provide public goods, but become captured by special interests and responsive to dysfunctional metrics when accountability is weak. The ghost cities emerged from a system that combined state capacity with market mechanisms, but failed to align incentives in ways that produced genuine human benefit. Future scenarios range across a spectrum of possibilities. In the optimistic version, China successfully transitions to a consumption and innovation-driven economy. As incomes rise and urbanization continues, the ghost cities gradually fill. What seems like wasteful overbuilding today becomes visionary preparation for tomorrow. The empty apartments house the next generation of migrants. The infrastructure supports economic activity that eventually materializes. The debt gets inflated away or refinanced at sustainable levels. This isn't impossible. Some ghost cities have partially filled as nearby established cities faced constraints and people sought more affordable options. The pessimistic scenario involves a debt crisis forcing austerity, mass bankruptcies, and social instability. Banks collapse or require massive government bailouts. Local governments default. The implicit social contract, tolerate one-party rule in exchange for rising living standards, fractures when growth stalls and unemployment spikes. Political upheaval follows economic crisis. This too has historical precedents. Authoritarian systems often appear stable until they suddenly aren't. More likely than either extreme is muddling through. Japan managed slow deflation and stagnation for decades without catastrophic collapse or dramatic recovery. The state's capacity to manage the process, to spread losses over time, to maintain employment even at the cost of inefficiency, proved substantial. China possesses even greater state capacity than Japan did. A long period of low growth, gradual deleveraging, and managed decline of the property sector seems plausible. This avoids crisis but means lower living standards than would otherwise have been possible. Resources consumed servicing old debts rather than funding new opportunities. Wildcard scenarios exist too. Climate change could drive migration patterns that create unexpected demand for housing in interior regions. Geopolitical shifts might make currently marginal cities strategically important. Technological change could enable remote work at scales that make location less important, potentially breathing life into well-connected ghost cities. These scenarios are speculative, but the future rarely unfolds exactly as predicted. What seems clear is that the fundamental tension between market discovery of preferences and state provision of stability will persist. Markets are cruel and unstable, but responsive to genuine human wants and needs. States can provide order and undertake long-term projects, but risk gigantic misallocation when insulated from feedback. Ghost cities represent what happens when state capacity meets misaligned incentives at unprecedented scale. They are monuments to human ambition, achievements of engineering and logistics, testaments to state power. They are also monuments to bureaucratic dysfunction, to the difficulty of economic planning, to the gap between intentions and outcomes. They stand as a cautionary tale without simple villains or heroes. The officials who built them weren't uniquely corrupt or incompetent. They responded to incentives in predictable ways. The system that created those incentives emerged from genuine attempts to develop a poor country rapidly while maintaining social stability. The theories that justified the approach came from serious economists grappling with real problems of unemployment and underdevelopment. Yet the outcome was waste on a civilizational scale. Walking through a ghost city today, you encounter layers of meaning congealed in concrete. The empty boulevards designed by optimistic planners. The apartment towers financed by debt instruments too complex for most to understand. The parks and plazas shaped by incentive structures that rewarded construction regardless of use. The whole ensemble reflecting theories about how economies work, assumptions about human behavior, and decisions made by thousands of individuals, each responding rationally to their local circumstances. The emptiness is no longer mysterious once you understand the system that produced it. It's overdetermined, the inevitable result of aligning powerful incentives toward measurable activity without adequate mechanisms to ensure that activity serves genuine human needs. Every empty window reflects a promotion earned. Every unused street lamp illuminates a GDP target met. Every fountain that will never enchant crowds represents a loan made and a land parcel sold. The question isn't whether China made mistakes. Every economic system does. The United States built entire suburbs and deserts that required unsustainable water imports. Japan built bridges to sparsely populated islands. The Soviet Union constructed factories that destroyed more value than they created. Ireland built housing estates during its Celtic tiger boom that became ghost estates after the crash. Wasteful investment is a human universal, not a Chinese peculiarity. The difference is one of scale and speed, made possible by a political economy that combined authoritarian capacity with market mechanisms but lacked the feedback systems to correct course before waste reached historic proportions. The question is whether we can learn from China's ghost cities, or whether the incentive structures embedded in our own systems, democratic or authoritarian, market or planned, blind us to our own versions of the same fundamental dynamic. Every system faces the challenge of aligning individual incentives with collective welfare. Every system struggles to distinguish between activity and progress, between measured growth and genuine development, between building things and building things worth building. The ghost cities force us to confront what development means and who it serves. They ask whether economic growth is valuable in itself or only insofar as it expands human capabilities and flourishing. They challenge the assumption that more construction, more infrastructure, more measurable activity necessarily represents progress. They demonstrate that spectacular visible achievements can coexist with profound underlying dysfunction. Perhaps the deepest lesson is about the limits of human knowledge and the difficulty of planning complex systems. The officials who approved these developments weren't stupid. The economists who justified them weren't frauds. The construction workers who built them weren't lazy. Everyone involved possessed local rationality, responding sensibly to the information and incentives they faced. Yet the collective outcome reveals something humbling about our capacity to organize economic life according to plan. The knowledge required to build a functioning city isn't contained in any blueprint or five-year plan. It emerges from millions of small decisions made by people pursuing their own goals, coordinated through the price system in ways that no central authority can replicate. Yet markets alone don't solve the problem. They produce their own forms of waste, their own bubbles and crashes, their own failures to provide public goods or account for long-term consequences. The challenge isn't choosing markets over planning or planning over markets. It's designing institutions that can harness the information processing power of decentralized decision-making while maintaining capacity for collective action toward genuinely shared goals, institutions that create incentives for behavior that serves broad human welfare rather than narrow bureaucratic metrics or speculative excess. China's ghost cities will stand for decades, physical monuments to an extraordinary economic experiment. Some may eventually fill as cities grow and populations shift. Others will likely crumble, maintained inadequately or not at all, their steel reinforcements rusting and their concrete facades weathering. Either way, they'll remain as evidence of what happens when the machinery of development becomes decoupled from the purpose of development, when the means becomes the end, when the scorecard being optimized diverges from the outcomes that actually matter. For those of us observing from outside China, the temptation is to see this as a foreign phenomenon, an artifact of authoritarian governance or socialist economics that couldn't happen in market democracies. But every society faces versions of the same fundamental challenges. Every political system struggles with misaligned incentives and faulty metrics. Every economy must navigate between the stability states can provide and the responsiveness markets enable. The ghost cities differ in degree, not in kind, from the pathologies that emerge wherever humans organize economic activity at scale. The story of China's ghost cities is ultimately a story about ourselves, about the systems we build, and the unintended consequences that emerge from them, about the gap between our intentions and our achievements, about the difficulty of knowing what we're optimizing for and whether we're succeeding. It's a story without a conclusion because the forces that produce these empty metropolises continue operating in China and everywhere else, generating new challenges that will test whether we've learned anything from watching concrete and ambition combine to create monuments to neither.